Hello, my name is Erika Maldonado Singh. I'm the Community Engagement Manager at the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future, and I want to welcome you to this conversation we're calling Geopolitics in the Pandemic Era. This is co-sponsored by USC Dornsife's Center for the Political Future and Department of Political Science and International Relations. This session is scheduled to go about an hour, and we'll take questions about 40 minutes into the discussion. You can begin to submit your questions now in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Our speakers will do their best to respond to as many as they can. Please make sure to only submit your questions in the Q&A section. This discussion is the first in the Political Science and International Relations in the Time of Pandemic series, which showcases virtual talks on research and expertise of USC faculty in the Political Science and International Relations Department and policy practitioners. Now I'll turn it over to Gregory Treverton, Professor of the Practice of International Relations and Spatial Sciences at USC Dornsife.
Thanks very much, Erika. It's a treat to be here and a treat to be with both the panelists and those people who are joining us virtually. I'm, as Erika said, a professor at USC. My last job in the government was as chair of the National Intelligence Council in the second Obama administration. That was the fourth time for me in government, probably more than the law should allow. But I look forward to our conversation today. Obviously, these are very confusing, unsettling times, and I hope we can provide, if not clarity, at least some pointers to thinking about it. We're going to imagine sort of the null hypothesis, as we'd call it in academia, about the COVID and post-COVID geopolitical future. I suppose we'd say continuity of trends, maybe those trends getting even sharper. Trends we've seen are growing political and economic nationalism. We've noted that even the EU members have stopped supplies of medical equipment across their borders from time to time. So we would imagine those economic and political nationalism to grow. We'd imagine that authoritarian politics would also grow given the opportunity of emergencies. I think we'd be concerned about the disconnect between citizens and their governments, even as governments grow. Interesting question whether citizens will feel like they've been, in many places at least, not everywhere, been let down by their government, not well served by their government. US-China conflict obviously predates this, hasn't gotten any better, in some ways has gotten worse, so we'd imagine that to continue. And I suppose last on my short list would be the tech giants who were pilloried or being pilloried a few months ago. Now they've turned out to be the heroes of this particular crisis because they provide us everything, including what we're doing right now, obviously food and education as well. So interesting question about the future role of those tech giants who have become important geopolitical actors in their own right. Well, I hope in the panel we can take a deeper dive into these and other issues. I'll start with a few starter questions to our panelists. We'll have a little conversation, and then, as Erika said, we'll open it to Q&A. The panel it's honored to be with. Let me just say a word about them. They may say a word about themselves if they'd like to. First, Thomas Campbell. Tom was a colleague of mine after having a distinguished academic career. He joined the National Intelligence Council, where he was the first National Intelligence Officer for technology. He once he left government, he is now forming a interesting international consultancy firm called FutureGrasp that is in the technology and future space. Second is Rob English. He's a friend and colleague of longstanding here at USC. He's a professor of international relations and environmental studies. He's an expert in many, many things, but I know him best as a Russia specialist and as a specialist in military affairs. And third is Ben Rhodes. Ben is a former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communication in the Obama administration. So we crossed a bit in that incarnation. He is the author of The World as It Is, a memoir of the Obama White House. It's gotten lots of press in recent months. And he is this spring a fellow at the Center for the Political Future. Let me start with you, Ben. You and I both worked in the Obama administration. I think we were both shared the sense that the counterterrorism mission was too dominating of US foreign policy. Now we've had an administration that's changed course pretty dramatically, is very focused on peer competitors, very much on China. I'd be interested in your thoughts about how the COVID crisis will reshuffle that geopolitical deck. And maybe in particular, will it have interesting effects on the foreign policy establishment, among whom I suppose I should include myself, what you call in your book, both aptly and in technical terms, the blob. So are we due for a reshuffle?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I myself has been a part of that establishment, of course, while occasionally critiquing it. But yeah, I mean, to try to do this quickly, I think it was very much President Obama's sense, certainly my own, that the structure of the national security apparatus of the U.S. was overwhelmingly focused towards terrorism. From the moment Obama took office, I think his 8 years can be seen as an effort to steadily recalibrate the resourcing and prioritization of issues to deal with a set of global challenges that are more likely to be defining of the next 20, 30, or 40 years. In the first term of the Obama administration, so much effort just went into kind of managing a series of things that we inherited, winding down the war in Iraq and trying to get arms around the war in Afghanistan, but dealing also with the fallout of the global financial crisis. And I'll come back to that. I think in the second term, you saw a much more dedicated effort that sparked a lot of controversy to kind of reorient American foreign policy around a different set of challenges. So you saw climate change become something of an organizing principle for our bilateral and multilateral relationships. I think people don't fully appreciate the extent to which you only got a Paris Agreement in 2016 or in 2015 because of years of making climate change a leading priority in bilateral and multilateral relationships. Particularly during and after the Ebola outbreak, you saw global health security emerging as an increasing focus and prioritization of both government organization and resourcing. And you saw the government trying to deal with technology and social media platforms as increasingly a national security threat, both when social media platforms were being utilized by ISIS, and of course through the Russian information war through the 2016 election, among other issues. And you saw this effort to kind of extricate the United States from Middle East conflicts, and the Iran nuclear agreement was a key part of that, to try to avoid military conflict and essentially mitigate the risk of an Iranian nuclear weapon through that agreement. So I highlight that just to indicate that was the direction that we were seeking to move American foreign policy in at the end of the Obama administration, deprioritizing terrorism, extricating the United States from the conflicts in the Middle East, a focus on the Asia-Pacific region as a defining region for American interests going forward, and then an effort to kind of restructure and reorient the government to deal with things like climate and health and technology. The Trump administration in rhetoric has focused on great power competition and in protectionism, has focused on China through the trade war. But if you look at the basic resourcing of the US government, they actually have not really broken from the post 9/11 consensus. And if anything, they've doubled down on it. The military budget has increased. The numbers of US troops in the Middle East has increased. So it's been this kind of odd duality where the things that Trump talks about are great power competition, but the functioning of the government is still very much weighted towards terrorism in the Middle East. I would hope, and frankly, the election in our country will determine this to some extent, that there is a really systematic effort to change the prioritization and resourcing of American foreign policy, national security policy, to focus on the actual threats to American security, pandemics, climate change, technology, artificial intelligence, how that intersects with nationalism and great power competition as the Chinese are gaining an advantage in those spaces. That would lead to resource reallocation. In an ideal world, that would be, I think, a significant rethinking of national security spending away from the kind of defense budget that we have and more towards applying resources to national security priorities, and also investing in innovation and research and development at home. the technological base, the base for everything from the development of vaccines to the development of new technologies has suffered relative to the defense budget in terms of spending as well. The last thing I'd say by opening is, I think that you're right in the short term that, the trends that you identified that will likely come out of this. Having lived through the financial crisis, though, what I've seen is that there's usually a second and third order effect to a global event of this size and scale. And that, frankly, what ended up happening with the financial crisis is it wasn't necessarily immediately apparent the extent to which that event collapsed global confidence among governments and publics in liberal democracy and in globalization and in American leadership. And that the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism that has characterized the last decade has a lot of its roots in the event of the global financial crisis and the blowback that hit governments that were in power, including Obama's, with the rise of the Tea Party and ultimately the emergence of Trump. And so what I would look for is whether or not, sure, I think in the near term, authoritarian leaders will clamp down. In the near term, this trend of nationalism will grow. But there's a blowback that's going to come, not just to the public health crisis, but to the economic crisis that is likely to last for many years. And so I think it's quite possible that just as there may be a reorientation of American foreign policy priorities if the election goes to the Democrats in the fall, that whether or not the election goes that way or not, we could see a year, 2 years, 3 years from now, some of the public anger, frankly, at what the circumstances are going to be in different countries, blowing back on some of these nationalist and authoritarian leaders and systems in interesting ways that could be either destabilizing or, frankly, potentially constructive. So I think that this is a story that's going to play out not over a year or two, but over 3 to 5 years and into the next decade.
Let me just tack a footnote on that. You've mentioned climate several times. It's interesting now that the air is cleaner everywhere because economic activity is ground down so low. But are you worried that as we try to restart our economics, that economics is going to take priority over thinking about environment and climate issues?
It's just a fantastic question. Hugely important, yes. Basically the process of getting to the Paris Agreement, which was the floor of what needs to be done to deal with climate change. It was meant to get more ambitious in terms of emissions reduction. We had to go to China, we had to go to India, we had to go to even more established economies like South Korea and convey to them that the value of transitioning to clean energy, which would be expensive in the short run, was going to be essential in the long run, both in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, but ultimately in terms of incentivizing investments in renewable energies that were going to be more, economically viable in the long run as, the world is forced to transition away from fossil fuels in the wiring of the global economy. My real concern is that in places like China and India that are going to suffer huge hits to economic growth, that the temptation of building back dirty, building back through coal-fired power plants, the temptation to move away from even their Paris targets in order to deal with the short-term economic stimulus that they seek could do a lot of damage to the Paris Agreement structure. And so there's going to have to be a real concerted effort to try to avoid a regression on action against climate as nations are prioritizing short-term economic stimulus over medium and longer term economic and climate policy. And hopefully the UN, the COP conference, the UN climate conference at the end of this year can be a mechanism for doing that, but I worry about that a lot.
Right. Tom, let me turn to you next and to technology. Technology and geopolitics have typically been tightly coupled. So my question for you would be, has the pandemic reduced or amplified that relationship? And more generally, what do you expect on the technology front and beyond as we move to a post-COVID era?
Well, great question, and thanks for the introduction, Greg. And thanks also to the USC for the invitation to speak with this distinguished panel. It's always a pleasure to join these kinds of discussions. So tech and geopolitics have gone hand in hand throughout history. And I would posit that once the coronavirus pandemic started this relationship got even tighter. With the need to social distance to minimize the coronavirus outbreak, work from home quickly became a top priority for those with capabilities and their employers' blessing or orders. Virtual meetings like we're doing now via teleconference platforms became the norm in the daily lives of many. And this surge in work from home has reinforced that telecom infrastructure is a national security asset that cannot be taken for granted. Advanced infrastructure such as 5G coming soon is a national priority and should be built and planned without consideration of class or wealth levels. So the strata of state alliances, even before the coronavirus, were hardly stable. Now with borders sealing, senior policymakers scramble to deal with the new world order. International diplomacy itself has slowed considerably as meetings and conferences have gone online, with others outright canceled. US government agencies, as we know in Washington, D.C., have been shuttered, with the majority focused now on combating the virus. New York City itself, a pandemic epicenter, has been on lockdown for over a month now, detrimentally affecting UN operations and activities. And diplomatic engagements must be held without physical proximity. And in essence, diplomacy has moved to phone, email, and virtual meetings. Negotiations of peace, non-virus global health issues, human rights, climate change, nuclear non-proliferation, and trade are all compromised or postponed indefinitely. This is from my UN colleagues and many from my other NATO colleagues and other colleagues in the EU. And so the rise of pandemic modeling also has become a policy driving tool, which cannot be ignored. Within the US, some states are aggressively ordering residents to shelter in place and give their citizens only, but others waffle and give their citizens only half-baked rules. So a rise of cities and states points to the potential for them to become even more important political actors in the future. On another point, in a height of irony, China is now executing global health diplomacy to help countries by sending them masks, test equipment, and medical staff. Whether or not it works is debatable from China, but the US, long a supplier of international aid, has stepped away from that role. Some states, such as Italy, have accepted massive aid from China in lieu of EU or US aid. And when it's now sealed borders and growing state isolationism, the EU is fragmented and trending away from its traditional support for open markets as it faces up to production dependency upon China and the US if it so chooses to. So changes to global political alignments were already well underway due to shifting economic factors pre-pandemic, including a disruptive US administration, a Brexit-distracted EU, an assertive China, and an attempt at a resurgent Russia. This lack of any discernible US leadership throughout the pandemic has made evident to many nations, both US allies and adversaries, that the US cannot be counted upon to lead a unified and comprehensive response to a crisis. This glaring absence of any organized international response beyond the focused efforts of the United Nations, notably the WHO, brought home to many world leaders the need to reconsider who their friends are and what they could count upon. So in essence, the changes in society and diplomacy, the rise of cities and states, and the strengthened activity in health diplomacy manifested by this coupling between tech and geopolitics suggest that we will remain in a rather unsettled geopolitical context for certainly the next several months, if not years, if not decades, as Ben Rhodes clarified so well earlier. We have grave concerns, and tech and geopolitics are very tightly coupled. I would answer in summary to your question. Whether that's a good coupling or not, it remains to be seen. We'll see how it all goes.
Well, it certainly is true that the U.S. reputation has taken a hit, both not being a leader, being sort of opposite of being a leader, and then since we've looked pretty incompetent in responding to the crisis, that I've always thought that countries look to the United States, partly because we were regarded as able to help them, competent in doing that. We've lost that image, at least for a time. How long is an interesting geopolitical question. Are there particular technologies, Tom, that you were focused on or especially interested in this particular time?
So in general, so FutureGrasp, as you mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of that, been going on for 2.5 years. Pre-pandemic, we were looking very deeply at artificial intelligence, or AI, as mentioned by Ben in an earlier statement. That still is very much an ongoing focus for us as a company. And I think it's even amplified, if anything, because of the drive now toward this intense digital presence that we all have. It is one of the striking statistics I read in New York Times a couple of weeks ago, is that one of the few spaces in tech which is absolutely no layoffs, in fact, intensely more hiring, is artificial intelligence. So data scientists, data researchers. there's no lack of jobs for those. So if any of the students out there are interested in that space, happy to put them in touch with people if they'd love to hear some founders and meet some founders and other folks, because it is an intensely active area that will not diminish. And I think as we move more and more into this sort of matrix-like world, it just amuses me, honestly, that I'm spending all my time on webinars, on Zoom and everything in this sort of two-dimensional world. We're going to even potentially go even more in depth into this digital world, and we'll see where it all develops. There's a lot of futurists out there who think we'll end up becoming digital avatars at some level. I'm not sure about that. I think we still need some deeply and personal, intense engagements. And so I look forward to being able to travel again once that is opened up. But digital world, I think even after the pandemic is mitigated or suppressed entirely, will become a part of our lives way more than it was pre-pandemic. And I think it will stay that way for quite a while. There are advantages to this world as well.
Well, I want to keep alive the question of what happens to U.S. leadership and U.S. image. It is one of the fascinating, sort of cruel paradoxes of what's happened, that the Chinese, where this started, have come so far, become looking like they're not only the leader, but the model. Interesting question how long that will last. The same question for the United States, which has come across looking like not the leader and hardly the model. So how enduring those geopolitical implications will be is a big question. But let me turn to you, Rob. We've talked a little bit about allies and alliances, but how will this crisis affect our alliances, particularly NATO and the European Union?
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to Ben and Thomas as well. Fascinating. You know, not so much in this group, but more generally, I think in our predictions, there's, I see a tendency to detect, we see short-run problems, but then this cautious optimism creeps in that things will return to normal. They'll get better over the medium and long term, and maybe even be better than before, that this will bring us closer. We see it on the environmental issues, that somehow seeing all this clean air and what might be will hasten our move away from fossil fuels. And we certainly see it in our domestic politics, right? We've seen that for a long time. If we can just survive Trump, another year, things will go back to normal, the way they were before. Well, the way, the more I follow events in Europe, the more pessimistic I am about the long run, not optimistic. It's not going to bring about a revival of the integrative, post-Cold War spirit of the 90s that some hope for. I think the spirit of the 2020s is going to be division, bitterness, national trends that are really, really destructive of transnational cooperation. One obvious cleavage is north-south, right? But this time it's not just Greece versus Germany, but Italy and Spain, who are really deeply resentful of Germany, France, Denmark, and others for the way they've acted. There is a massive well of anger and emotion in these really hard-hit countries who feel stigmatized, they feel abandoned, and that really has not yet spilled over into EU politics and NATO politics, but it will. Salvini will be back. That's one prediction. Another cleavage is East-West. Central and Eastern Europe have really been spinning their wheels for a decade now. Most never really recovered from the financial crisis of 2008. I think Ben is absolutely correct here. I would say it even more strongly. And often we tend to focus on, the most optimistic Polish or Baltic elite politicians, those who are the most pro-NATO and pro-EU forces. But even in those countries, I think it's true that a majority of the population still have not regained their pre-crisis, their pre-2008 political and economic status. And in most of the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the situation is really, really grim for a majority of the population. And that's why the Mideast refugee crisis of 2015, why it hit so hard and why the populist and xenophobic forces could ride it to electoral victories. We have been often kind of obsessively focused on Russian influence and Russian interference in Eastern Europe, and often turn to that as sort of a default explanation to explain the rise of Eurosceptical authoritarians like Viktor Orban in Hungary. But I think it's really the persistent poverty and corruption and this larger sense that the whole process of post-communist transition and joining the European Union has really only benefited a small elite, that these are the main causes of the popular anger and distrust. And the pandemic is only going to make all this a lot worse. You know, this economic shutdown, this deep and prolonged recession that's likely to follow, and the drying up, unavoidably, of a lot of European Union aid will only drive deeper wedges, you know, between the wealthier north of Europe and the south, but especially Eastern Europe. Look, just consider what's underway in Ukraine, a country that we sometimes just sort of don't worry too much about at the moment. It's a future NATO member. We hope a stable anchor against expanded Russian influence. They overthrew, after all, their pro-Russian president. 5 years ago, they immediately signed an EU accession agreement. Yet since that time, corruption has only gotten worse. Economically, the country hasn't just stagnated. It has literally fallen behind countries like Moldova or Kosovo to now be officially the poorest country in all of Europe. And it only survives, right, economically, because so many millions of its workers have gone abroad to do service jobs, construction, you know, the bottom of the economic ladder in other EU countries. And now those countries are shutting down. The jobs have closed and they're coming home. And there's nothing for them but a lockdown country of their own, a poverty-stricken lockdown country. President Zelensky, right, in whom we invested so much hope, had an approval rating of 73% less than 1 year ago. And now it's 40%, right? And opinion polls show that approval of the European Union is falling, that support for joining NATO is low, below 50%. It's always been below 50%. And so the larger picture, I guess the trends I see are that aid to the poorer southern and eastern countries of Europe is falling, will continue to fall. The nationalist backlash will grow. Authoritarians like Orban will be strengthened. And throughout all of this, Russian influence and Chinese investments in particular will grow, right? Just when this massive depression is about to hit, and as you pointed out, transatlantic leadership is completely absent. So I thought about how I would summarize all this, and I just said, maybe paint this sad picture. In the past, you know, we in the US, our presidents could rally a coalition to support us on key international crises, right? The Gulf War in 1991 or in Afghanistan in 2002. Right? I am afraid, at least for the foreseeable future, that the next time a US president asks our allies to back us in a coalition, the only volunteers are going to be Kosovo, Poland, maybe Georgia, and maybe not even all three of those. I can't put it any more pungently.
Well, let me turn you, before we open it to the audience, to a slightly different direction. Although I can't but say that I'm always been a little skeptical about approval ratings. One of my first jobs in government was working for Jimmy Carter, and we were frankly happy when he was in double-digit approval ratings, right? So it's these things say something, but not everything. Ben raised earlier the question about, noted that the Trump administration, despite its rhetoric, had really sort of doubled down on the military in that sense. So my question for you, Rob, would be, in the short run, what's going to be the effect on U.S. military readiness? We saw the Roosevelt, one of the crown jewels of the Navy, unable to operate. But beyond that, do you see longer-term impacts from COVID on military strategy?
I do. Again, to put it pungently, the era, at least for the foreseeable future, of defense budgets approaching $750 billion annually is over. I don't see how that can be sustained, given the demands we're going to face here at home. And I think that will do a lot of things. Most importantly, it'll accelerate, right, this trend towards AI, towards autonomous weapons. We can call it high tech. And away from legacy manned systems. In other words, 100 million per stealth fighters and $13, $14 billion aircraft carriers. That's just unaffordable. And that trend, as I say, is already underway. So it will simply accelerate it. It'll bring problems of its own, right? A lot of these systems carry with them ethical issues of devolving command and control and use of force decisions, lower and lower down, all the way, in fact, to machines instead of humans. And as we go into the Space Force development, if that proceeds rapidly, the possibility of deploying weapon systems, not just sensors, but weapon systems in space, with this trend towards automation and unmanned vehicles, moving humans from the loop, raise questions of unintentional impact on stability, accidental escalation. So that longer trend has a lot of things that have to be worked out. And unfortunately, we're in an era of arms control and cooperation fraying, right? The INF Treaty is done. The Open Skies Treaty over. And now we very likely will see the START Treaty. Unless something dramatic happens between the US and Russia, that will go away too. So a trend towards, more autonomous unmanned systems and dependence on AI, when many ethical and command systems have not been figured out at a time of collapsing arms control frameworks, is also worrisome. But those probably won't hit the real problems for, the better part of a decade.
Thank you. Let us, Erika, open to questions from the audience. If the question is to a particular person, we'll indicate that. Otherwise, we'll throw it up for grabs and see who wants to take it on. Erika.
All right. Can everybody see and hear me? Sorry about that. So we have a question from Mia Spire, and she's asking, her question has to do with the oil collapse and geopolitics. President Trump is negotiating with Russia and Saudi Arabia to curb production due to the plummeting oil prices. She's curious as to how the oil collapse will impact geopolitics, particularly countries with less of an economic cushion than the US, such as Iraq, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Russia.
Anybody want to take that one?
I'll start, sure.
Say a word about Russia, since the one thing Russia can be counted on is not to obey any cuts, right? We know that.
Yeah, so I think that if I divine it correctly, and I rely on the real experts in oil politics and the oil industry to do so, if I read them correctly, the description of what's happened was that Russia gambled with a kind of a power play vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia when they refused to go along with the new restrictions, and overplayed their hand. If there hadn't been the COVID crisis hitting and shutting down world economies, it might have been different, and that would have provided some price support. But the oil war, if you will, at the same time as everyone's shutting down and demand is going through the floor, meant Russia's move was unsustainable and they had to back down. So it was a little bit humiliating. But more broadly, Russia has approximately 600 billion in a rainy day fund. They are actually better positioned than most of the middle producers like the Angolas, Nigerias, Algeria, Venezuela, certainly, to ride things out. I'm, again, with my focus on Central and Eastern Europe, more worried about Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, right? They depend entirely. These are true petrostates. Russia has still a fairly diverse economy in contrast to real petrostates. And so, again, the possibility that those collapses will inflame politics, instability, and that only plays ultimately to Russia's and China's advantage as the regional hegemons.
So what you're watching is really the second order producers, the Turkmenistans, the Nigerias,
yes,
who really can't weather this kind of low prices.
For Russia and for Putin himself, if Mia's question is wondering about the impact domestically in Russia, again, Russia has a pretty significant cushion, and the resilience of that regime, and frankly, the resilience of society, makes me skeptical of people who predict mass instability, protest, that this could be the death knell of the Putin regime. I don't see that, and those predictions in the past have usually been, predictions of Putin's political death have obviously not borne out. And Russia has some resilience there, considerable resilience still.
Anyone want to add anything, or we'll go on to the next question?
Yeah, I'd say I don't predict Putin's demise. I do think his situation is a bit more precarious in the sense that, if you look, there's basically been phases to Putinism. And the first decade was this transition of Russia into a Putinist state, essentially, aided and abetted by high oil prices that had standards of living and economic indicators moving in a positive direction. We've kind of lived through the second decade of Putinism, where in a world of diminishing world prices and then some economic shocks to that economy, including external sanctions, he's pivoted more to assertive foreign policy and national security measures, Crimea, the war in Ukraine, Syria, assertions of Russian nationalism at home and abroad, to kind of maintain his political position. And I think his political position, you know, there are polls that show his approval rating not for United Russia, for his party, as low as 30%. So I think it's, you know, going to be a bit of a bumpy decade for Putin. I agree that, you know, he's got a cushion. He's got both a rainy day fund and also just an infrastructure that keeps him in power that doesn't show any signs of atrophy. What does that mean? That it might not mean mass unrest. It might mean, you know, Putin's going to have to find, if the economic picture in Russia continues to languish, and there's continued kind of brain drain of younger generation, it may mean that he needs to continue to do what he's been doing, frankly, the last 5 to 10 years, which is find episodic opportunities to gin up nationalism at home or abroad through asserting himself in Eastern Europe, through asserting himself perhaps even militarily in former Soviet space, to just kind of demonstrating his stature on the world stage. And I just do think that, again, I don't want to overly optimistically predict some mass public uprising that ousts Putin and transitions Russia to a better place. It could be good, bad, or in between. I do think there'll be some more sense of political unrest around Putin, and the risk that leads to, you know, Putin lashing out or Putin seeking to find new ways of consolidating, you know, his political position through nationalism. I'd watch that space for the next 5 years, because I do think that the foundation that he's sitting on is creaking a bit, and he's getting older. You know, this is not someone who's going to stay perpetually the same age, you know, and there is, I think, I'd probably be a little more, you know, pessimistic just about his domestic position. Again, I agree that doesn't mean it's going to lead to his demise, but it could lead to unpredictability, as we've experienced the last decade.
Thank you. Okay, what next?
This question is from Shweta Ganesh. Is the idea of sustainable development incompatible with the drive for consumption and its effects on economic resources, especially post-pandemic when economic production will skyrocket?
This is a bit like the question about climate, right? Whether it's going to be a casualty as we work hard to restart our economies. Anybody want to, Tom, you have a thought about that?
So I'll weigh in from the technology perspective. So there was a body of work that it continues to this day on so-called resilience technology. So that is to say, sustainable development technology. So your solar cells, your power stations powered by wind, et cetera, et cetera. That I think is going to perhaps sadly be diminished. I think Ben's comment, or maybe it was Robert's comment about whether people in the countries would go back to the so-called dirty coal and so forth. There will be an easy tendency to do that because it's quick, it's cheap, and especially if oil is essentially a negative dollar value per barrel, it's going to be hard to convince countries to invest in these sustainable development technologies. They nevertheless need to do, obviously. Climate change is not going away just because we're all locked down and in a pandemic. Yes, there has been a diminishment of pollution in the air. Overall, though, from the numbers I've heard, we still are going to have an increase in temperature overall in 2020. It's pushing us higher and higher. There's still only about a 5% reduction in overall nasty things in the atmosphere, even with the pandemic, even with the shutdown, because it is occurring so late. And moreover, when countries start to ramp back up the so-called reopening approaches, it's most likely going to go right back to where we were before in that pollution level. So sustainable development is still super important, but I'm deeply concerned, especially countries that have been relying on oil so long. Suddenly they'll say, we can get basically free oil. Why should we invest in sustainable development technologies? Maybe Ben has some further comments on that as well.
Yes. Erika, what we go next? Let's go next.
Ben, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely correct. And I, again, the only note I'd add to it is, the political dynamic in the West in particular, you see younger voters, younger citizens expressing different levels of frustration with inaction on climate. And because frankly, everybody knows that to truly deal with the issue, you need to fundamentally reconstruct the global economy. And that's just not happening, except in some pockets of places. And it's led to climate strikes in Europe. It's led to, essentially kind of a bifurcation of the Democratic Party in this country, where younger voters supported people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. I think in 5 years, if this trend continues, you could see, a potential for a significant degree of generational political mobilization that we're not fully pricing in. And by the way, not just kind of constructive, mobilization, but real, potentially disruptive political mobilization. I just think that it's not sustainable to have such a gap between the knowledge that younger people have in the world about their own future and the decisions being made by people in power in business and government. So I put another, not to be pessimistic, but this is another one where I just think if this trend line continues, and again, we have a surge in consumption after the bottoming out of the pandemic, I think the risk for political unrest, even in Western societies, because of this inaction, will grow, frankly. And at some point that could boil over.
In principle, it's fascinating because in principle, just as the COVID pandemic has showed that the inadequacies of our healthcare system, so you'd think there would be a great incentive to rethink and rebuild that. So too, it's not inevitable that we have to rebuild the same old unequal economy.
Yeah.
This could be thought of as a great opportunity, but we've tended to say, well, the short-term pressures are going to take us mostly in the negative, not a positive direction. Next question, Erika.
Sarish Thacker asks, Africa has responded more quickly than other continents. Why has it still not been recognized or been given more support from the global north?
I mean, I would say that in what's happened in this crisis, as I think Greg alluded to in the opening, right, is that given the trend of already the trend towards nationalism in politics, everybody's been focused on themselves, and there just hasn't been any the way in which the prism to which people have seen this excludes, frankly, just about anybody other than the country that they're in. And when that happens, Africa is usually and unfortunately overlooked in geopolitical discussions. And I think in the context of COVID-19, that's certainly been the case. I do think that it's also just the case that you haven't seen, in part because of steps that have been taken, in part because of the nature of the flow of people in the global economy, and in part, frankly, we don't quite know the full impact of heat and climate on the spread of the virus. Africa has thus far been spared. I do worry about the lack of public health infrastructure in a lot of African countries if and when you do have a significant outbreak. I was talking to someone in South Sudan the other day where there are less than 200 doctors and 4 ventilators in the whole country. And so the challenge is going to be if and when you have a significant spread of COVID-19 in some of these African countries that have minimal public health infrastructure, the performance of the international community, the WHO and its donor nations to deal with that is not, would not make me optimistic. And I worry in general, to broaden the point a bit, that governments and philanthropies that have been generally donor in a position of being donors to particularly the most vulnerable African states and most vulnerable states in the global South are already changing their funding priorities to deal with COVID-19 needs at home. So you're going to have in the next 3 to 5 years, I think a dramatic reduction probably in funding for the most vulnerable, refugees, states like South Sudan, and that could lead to some pretty tragic outcomes. So my hope is that even as budgets for governments are strained, I do think it's going to be imperative that foundations, philanthropies, wealthy individuals, keep an eye on this, because thus far it hasn't hit, but if and when it does, it could be catastrophic. And even if it doesn't, existing needs that are tied to the international donor community are going to get worse. I mean, just one more anecdote on this. I was talking to someone who deals in the refugee space, and some of these refugee camps don't even have any health workers there because they've all left because they've been called back home. I mean, we don't even know the full truth of what's happening in some of the in some of the refugee camps. So again, a note of optimism thus far on the response and the impact on Africa, but unfortunately, I do worry about what could happen.
Yeah, it's easy to imagine a real disaster given crowded conditions, poor health care, as you say, the nationalism that has people maybe less generous than they should be in the richer North. Perhaps it's a good thing that the Gates Foundation spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization. But private philanthropy can't do it all. Erika.
So this question's from Meredith McCabe, and she says, there have been a lot of discussions suggesting that the U.S. should hold China accountable for their initial response or lack of open information surrounding COVID-19. How do you suspect the U.S. will, quote unquote, punish China, if at all, when we rely on Chinese supply chains for many essential goods?
It's a good question. You want to start, Rob?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I, in fact, was just thinking this is absolutely a question for those who have been most recently at high levels of government, because it's political. I can tell you what I think should happen, but the question was, what will we do? And I'm not qualified.
I can comment on the supply chain aspect of it. So definitely, FutureGrasp with Greg's review, actually, we published a paper recently on globalization following coronavirus. It's available on our website if anybody'd like to read it. I think the comments are pretty much still resonating, even though it was published 3 weeks ago, which is ancient history now in the COVID-19 world. In essence, there's going to be a contraction of globalization overall. And I think that will ultimately hurt China, whether it's intentional or not. Because the United States, as a country and amongst all its corporate entities, needs to step away from having these very fragile, very brittle global supply chains in which there might be a sealed border, or there might be a tariff, or there might be something that impinges upon their profitability that was already underway even pre-pandemic days. And I think it has been magnified dramatically now with all the sealed borders. There's some brilliant websites that from the United Nations and other spaces that talk about the number of shutdowns worldwide and so forth. And I'm happy to share the link with Erika. Maybe she can share with the rest of the attendees and so forth. But it is staggering, the amount of global supply chain reduction. And so whether that, again, ultimately leads to an intentional or unintentional penalty for China, I think it will occur. Whether the administration does anything more than they've already done in terms of dramatic tariffs and these other things remains to be seen. But the global supply chain as an issue from throughout the world will be constricted, at least in the near term. And I think companies are realizing, there's actually a level of efficiency they can gain if they produce things more within state than out of their country and abroad. And that will just be magnified in the coming months, years. Amongst the CEOs and so forth I've talked to, that is a very strong trend in the Fortune 500 right now.
I just add to this, look, in the context of an American presidential election cycle, I'd expect a lot of this to be rhetorical. I think the reality of the Trump policy to date is a lot of it has been rhetorical. There's been the trade war, which didn't really actually deal with some of the underlying issues with respect to intellectual property and state subsidies in China, but rather just dealt with some symbolic efforts to get them to buy more stuff. So I think you'll see a lot of hot rhetoric, and it's hard to anticipate, though, action that it's not just the global supply chains. It's at a time of a deep recession. The notion of imposing tariffs and resuming a trade war would strike me as not likely, and that's been the tool that Trump has reached for. I think you could see, there are other kind of, again, symbolic things, not symbolic, they're meaningful, but other steps that the Trump administration has flirted with, like kicking out all Chinese students from the United States, that again, I think would be self-defeating, but would be an action that doesn't, necessarily, at least in the short term, have the same impact on the economic indicators, although I think in the long run it has a lot of impact. Here's what I'd watch though. As this continues, I think whether the U.S. decides to start to really intervene in ways that make the Chinese Communist Party maximally uncomfortable, does the United States start to try to re-engage the Taiwan issue in different ways? Do we start to insert ourselves much more directly in the Hong Kong issue? If the United States wants to truly kind of go on offense against not just kind of unfair Chinese trade practices, or not just competition with China in the South China Sea, but an ideological confrontation, there are things that the U.S. government could do in a second Trump term. In a second Trump term, I think that would have the flavor of, upending the international, pulling out of the WTO and, resuming a trade war, perhaps if the economy can stomach it, but also kicking out Chinese foreign students, perhaps moving towards some more assertive support for Taiwan, challenging directly China's military ambitions in the South China Sea, and things that could actually risk conflict in the medium term. I think even a Democratic administration would be more likely to be certainly less cautious than the Obama administration was in confronting China. I do think there's something of a realignment happening both within the U.S. national security establishment and within the broader body politic that is going to be searching for more confrontational steps to take towards China. And that, to me, that is actually appropriate in some fashion, but it needs to be managed very carefully so as to avoid conflict or counterproductive steps, like the one I mentioned with respect to students.
For me, the sadness is that in principle, this ought to be a time during the pandemic when we're cooperating with China.
Yeah, we should be, yeah.
The Chinese haven't made it easy. Their lack of transparency, their lying has really just played into the hands of those who want to make China the villain and those who want to have a new Cold War with China. And that seems to me to be worrisome. Erika.
We have a question from Natalia Paraz, and she asks, could this pandemic be an opportunity to better relations with Cuba? If the U.S. healthcare system is continued to be overwhelmed, do you think the U.S. will welcome Cuban doctors to fight this pandemic? Do you think medical or quote unquote mask diplomacy could produce cooperation post-pandemic?
So anybody want to take that one?
I'll take that one. I obviously negotiated the normalization of relations with the Cuban government. The answer is no, it won't. At least while Trump is president, because he, basically runs his Cuba policy out of the most hardline parts of Miami, and so they have no interest in that. I will say, it's in 2014, I went to the Cubans. I went to Alejandro Castro, Raul Castro's son, and asked them to support the effort against Ebola in West Africa. And Cuba ended up sending hundreds, if not thousands, of doctors who were hugely helpful in that effort. They had experience in Africa. They had experience deploying. Whatever you think about the Cuban system, and there's a lot to criticize, and whatever you think about their use of doctors in some cases to gain influence, in that case, they were among the most important parts of the international coalition that confronted this in West Africa. And it opened up the door to potential diplomatic cooperation. So we then started to work with Cuba and Haiti on medical diplomacy. We then even invited Cuban doctors on board some of the US military health ships. It's amazing to think about where we were 3 years ago. And so if there's a change in administration, given that we'll probably still be in a pandemic, if the US and Cuba are looking to resume ways to cooperate and to build back some of the trust that's been unraveled in the last 3 years, I think this is one of the places that you could start. again, if there's a change in administration. I worry about Cuba's, they've got the medical infrastructure to deal with this. I worry more about the compounding impact of the pandemic on their economic picture, where you have already extreme poverty in Cuba that will likely be exacerbated by this, in addition to the US sanctions that have been reimposed in recent years. So right now, no, but I do think in a normal world, you would try to find opportunity in crisis. You try to find ways to build new relations with countries, or to open up new diplomatic doors in a crisis response, or to collaborate more effectively across borders. Unfortunately, the opposite is happening in this crisis, not just in our country, but in multiple countries. And so those opportunities are being missed.
Yeah. Erika.
This next question is from Aryam Nagash. Considering the COVID-19 pandemic, does the US ever plan on considering easing the sanctions on Iran, since the sanctions have caused vast negative economic impacts on the country, which in fact has hurt their ability to contain the virus?
Would you give the same answer, Ben?
I would. I mean, and again, I try just quickly, like, just from a humanitarian aspect, I mean, it's atrocious that we're not lifting some of these, or relaxing or suspending some of these sanctions. It is a fact. It was a fact even on the Obama administration that we had to work hard to correct, that the sanctions are so widespread that it denies medical equipment from getting into Iran. There's supposed to be humanitarian exceptions, but countries look at this, businesses look at this and say it's not worth risking, an enforcement action from the US to do some big sale of ventilators to Iran. And so the Iranian government has handled this very poorly, about as badly as anybody, but it's been dramatically compounded by US sanctions. And so just from a humanitarian perspective, you should be lifting those sanctions. I think similarly, as a diplomatic opportunity, what you would normally be doing is saying, okay, can we combine an effort to work unusually with Iran to address the humanitarian aspect with an effort to try to use that to change the diplomatic tone and get at some of the issues that are dividing us. Instead, Trump is doing the opposite. And so the fact of the sanctions is probably hardening Iranian views, not just government views, but public views against the United States in ways that will stay in the Iranian memory for many, many years, if not decades. So we're not only, doing the wrong thing from a humanitarian perspective, we're again missing a diplomatic opportunity. If this is still around when there's a new administration, it may be too late, but I would counsel that new administration to try to use some, if there's still public health crisis, some humanitarian gesture to restart the diplomacy that we had started in the Obama years. But again, another missed opportunity in my view.
Shall we do one more?
All right, let's see. What steps do you think the US can take to rectify its dwindling reputation?
Why don't we ask all our panelists to comment on that one? That's a good question to end on. Rob, you want to start?
Elect a new president.
Tom?
So I would say, in addition to Robert's excellent comment, we need to do more outreach to other states. We have been dissing our allies ever since the Trump administration came on board, and that has done, I think, in my personal opinion, more damage than really anything in the world in some ways. Technology outreach can be a very powerful thing too. Pre-pandemic, there was talk a lot about doing joint collaborations with China and some EU and some others in the space, particularly about artificial intelligence. That needs to be amplified across the board. Public health diplomacy, we could definitely do a lot more of, like China is doing right now. It saddens me to no end to see that we basically step back all US aid to countries in a time of where the leadership of this world needs the United States now more than ever before. So all these things we could do, I doubt it'll be done in the next few months, unfortunately.
Ben, you want to make a final comment?
Yeah, I guess the final comment I make is that one of the ways I look at this question is, because we came in 2009, US standing had taken a hit because of Iraq and the financial crisis, and a lot of the first year was Obama trying to reestablish our position in the world. I think the challenge is getting much harder for whoever the next president is. And here's why. It's not just the fact that Donald Trump is president of the United States. It's the fact that we elected Donald Trump president of the United States that I find that concerns people around the world. That, in other words, it's not, I think I agree with everything that was said about alliances and the need to have initiatives. But what I would say is that before we have the credibility to gain anything like the position we once had, we have to demonstrate that we're getting our house in order at home. And that's not just electing a president, is our democracy functioning? Do we have this kind of absurd political and media culture that people are watching? And people are watching amidst the pandemic, you know, the president of the United States talking about injecting disinfectants. I mean, we do not look like we have our stuff together, you know, and just electing a new president is not going to change the doubts that have been planted in people's minds. Because what sustained American leadership for so many decades wasn't the genius of our foreign policy, because frankly, we made a lot of mistakes, even though we did a lot right. It was the fact that we looked like we had the best example in the world. We had a democracy that worked. We had an economy that was the cutting edge. We were at the leading edge of innovation. That's not the case anymore. Our system is dysfunctional. You know, our economy is hugely unequal, and China looks like they're more innovative than us. And so I think we have to recognize that cleaning up our own mess and making our democracy work better is going to be imperative to playing that role on the world stage. I do think that some version of American leadership is still available for the simple reason that nobody else is providing it. I mean, we're seeing right now, there's not another, sure, China's shipping a bunch of equipment around the world, but they can't mobilize an international response to something like this. They don't have the muscle memory. They don't have the alliances. They don't have the institutions. And so I think if and when we demonstrate we're getting our act together, there's still an opening for America to play a leadership role in the world that somewhat resembles the role we played in the past. But we have to rebuild the house before we can have the credibility to go around the world and help fix up other people's houses. I mean, unfortunately, we have to do that at the same time. But again, I would start at home and then work out.
That's a great place to end. One of the hardest things in my intelligence incarnations is trying to tell policy people how the United States looks to others.
Yeah.
We always think we are on the side of the angels and everybody sees us that way. And I think you're exactly right. What we say is a lot less important than what we are.
Yeah.
And that does mean the task has to begin at home. Well, I apologize to all those whose questions didn't get answered, but it's been a very rich conversation. Many thanks to friends and colleagues, Ben, Rob, Tom. It's been a really fascinating hour for me. Erika, do you want to close us or you?
Yeah, I will just say thank you all and look forward to partnering again soon. Thanks all for joining us.